Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Alex McLevy.
Zack Snyder's Justice League, otherwise known as the Snyder Cut, is now improbably available to stream on HBO Max in all its bombastic 4-hour glory. Is it better than the theatrical cut? Is it worse? Does the Flash still hate brunch? We'll discuss that and more on this special bonus episode of the podcast.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, folks, welcome again to Film Club, and thank you for listening to this very special bonus episode of the show. Again, Katie Reif is off covering the South by Southwest Film Festival in its virtual edition this year, so I have the pleasure of speaking today with Alex McLevy, coworker, friend, fellow comics-weaned cinephile. If you're listening here today, we talked about the DCEU in general on the main episode this week. So that's available. However you're listening to this, if you scroll over, you can listen to a full episode where we talk about the DCEU. If you're a big DC fan, you might hate us afterwards. We tried to say some nice things too, but Alex, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. So I wanted to mention something up front before we get into the Snyder Cut, which is that you and I have actually talked about an alternate cut of a Zack Snyder movie before. A few years ago when they released the longer director's cut of Batman v Superman, you and I sat down for a video where we talked about the differences between the two cuts.
That's right.
That might be available on the site now. I actually don't know, but
it's
you might be able to find it.
Yeah, you might be able to find if you do the right combination of Google keywords, you could probably find it.
That's right, or maybe not. Who knows? It might be there somewhere on Kidja. We don't know. But yeah, we definitely discussed a longer Snyder cut before. But that film was, I don't know. I feel like maybe the long cut of that is maybe 2 hours and 45 minutes. Mm-hmm. That is a blink of the eye compared to the whopping 4 hours that Zack Snyder's long-awaited cut of Justice League runs.
Yeah, this is everything in the kitchen sink, and then he went out to the store and bought a few more kitchen sinks to throw in as well.
For those who don't know the sort of long, tortured story of Justice League, there's a very good article that could summarize it better than I will, although I will summarize it briefly. But there's an article in Vanity Fair about it. It's called Justice League: The Shocking, Exhilarating, Heartbreaking True Story of the Snyder Cut, and it sort of takes the reader through the last few years, and the whole troubled production of this movie. But for those who don't want to do that, I will quickly summarize what the Snyder Cut is. Zack Snyder has directed a number of the DCEU films. He made Man of Steel. He made Batman v Superman. As its subtitle suggests, Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, was intended as a kind of stepping stone into a larger cinematic universe of many heroes. His next film was Justice League, which sort of brings together not just Batman and Superman, but also Aquaman, Cyborg, Wonder Woman, and The Flash, all under one umbrella, just like the old comics. The movie was a very troubled production. A lot of it had to do with DC's waning faith in Snyder and in the version of the movie that he was making. They wanted something that was a little closer to Marvel, honestly. They wanted something that was a little more fun, so he had a lot of, I think he describes them as babysitters on set. And then he was forced away from the production because of a family tragedy and sort of decided not to try to fight the studio on the film anymore. Joss Whedon, director of The Avengers, was brought in to do some rewrites, but also to do some reshoots. It is estimated that maybe upwards of 70% or so was reshot. And the Snyder Cut, as it's called, was this kind of, I'm sorry, folks, I know this is a very long explanation, but the Snyder Cut was, Zack Snyder said, there's enough footage, I can put together my original version of this. And fans lobbied for that for years. They wanted to see his version. And last year, Warner Brothers finally said, you know what, fuck it, we'll release Zack Snyder's version. He was given some $70 million more money to shoot some additional stuff and make it into a debatably coherent movie. On HBO Max, you can now watch his full version, and it is in some respects, I feel it is both a very different movie and the same movie. And do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. I was actually, given how much we had sort of been told that Whedon had reshot, and given how much sort of emphasis had been placed on the fact that he redid quite a bit, what actually surprised me most was to see how much of Snyder's footage was actually in that original theatrical version of Justice League. You know, so much of what we saw was actually just radically trimmed down and edited and rearranged versions of the footage that is now in its full, originally intended lengthy glory.
Yeah, there, like, so much of it was in that movie. Although something that Snyder does is he uses different takes. And one of the first things, I would say that for maybe the first hour of this thing, I found it very fascinating just trying to tell on a scene-by-scene basis what was different. Mm-hmm. And so you'll get a scene. There's a scene very early in the film where Bruce Wayne goes to find Aquaman. He goes to this tiny little fishing village to talk to Arthur Curry, played by Jason Momoa. And the scene plays out pretty much exactly as it does in the theatrical cut. But the take is different. And you notice that Whedon, I mean, everyone kind of assumed this over the years, and it was no secret that this was part of his role. Mm-hmm. But Whedon literally was adding, like, jokes between beats of dialogue.
Yep.
So he was reshooting stuff to look as much as it could like the stuff that Snyder had shot, and just sort of like he was acting as I forget if there's a name for this, but where in animation when they'll sometimes get comedians, Patton Oswalt has talked about this, to like write random jokes that they can kind of put in there, and you can hear
punch up, I believe is the term.
Punch up, you're right. Yeah, that's exactly the word I'm looking for. Punch up. Whedon does a lot of punching up because that scene, that particular scene that I'm talking about, there's like a couple jokes in there that were never supposed to be there. Yeah. So you watch it and you realize that it more or less plays the same in terms of plot, but the jokes are gone and the tone is a little different. And that is the whole movie, I think, in some respects.
I agree. I mean, the thing that I wanted to bring up, I'm glad you mentioned that scene. Let's talk about how that scene ends as opposed to the original version of Justice League, which, you know, not only is Joss Whedon adding these jokes, these little, you know, quick beats here and there to lighten the tone, but also, you know, when you see the version as it is now in the Snyder Cut, when it ends fairly quickly in Whedon's version. In this version, at the end of it, these women from this small, isolated fishing village begin this portentous hymn that is presumably in honor of the mighty Aquaman, and it goes on for several minutes.
It's like Midsummer or something. It turns into Midsummer briefly.
It's confounding, yeah.
Another point about that scene, because so they walk outside and basically Aquaman goes into the water, and you're right, the scene ends with these women singing a hymn as he goes away. Before that, however, there's even a moment where Aquaman says the strongest man is strongest alone. And in the Whedon cut, Bruce Wayne quips back at him, that's not a saying, that's the opposite of the saying. Yeah. Which I think is true, in fact. Mm-hmm. I think it is the opposite of the saying. Yep. But in the Snyder cut, there's no commentary on that at all. So it almost feels like there were times when Whedon basically was almost making fun of the movie that he was hired to rewrite and reshoot.
Yeah, and that I agree with that. Like, one of the things that I think is interesting about this movie, I have a hard time imagining anybody who's going to watch this, aside from maybe kids who were still too young when the first Justice League came out. Mm-hmm. I feel like most people who are going to watch this are people who watched Whedon's version of Justice League and are curious to see this version, right? Whether they're people who were behind the release of the Snyder Cut or not. I think it's going to be comic book movie fans who are like, oh, there's a new version of this movie that I've already seen once, but now it's got 4 hours and less jokes. What does that look like? And it looks sort of like what you might imagine it would look like. It's a much longer, more drawn out version of the thing you already saw.
Yeah, it's bizarre and fascinating maybe more in the abstract than in actually sitting through the whole thing, to be honest. Mm-hmm. But it is because so much of the plot is more or less unchanged. Yeah. I mean, like if you were to give like a synopsis of what happens in the movie Justice League, it would be more or less the same. I mean, it follows the same plot trajectory. There are detours. There are a lot of detours in the long Zack Snyder version. And there are details that change, little ways that they get from one part to the other, where you can tell that Whedon is doing some reconstructive surgery there and papering over things that they cut out. But in the general shape of the plot, it's the same movie. So those expecting that this is going to tell a different story, it tells the same story. It's all a matter of execution, and often in something as seemingly minimal as the tone of a scene. Because I do think that there's a lot of new footage in this, and we'll talk about the action scenes, which I think are improved in my opinion. Yeah. But beyond that, there are a lot of moments where it's clear that Snyder is just using a different take that's slightly less funny.
Yeah, that's very true. And also, yeah, he does. And not only that, but it also, you're saying, it's sort of startling because you see how such a little thing goes such a long way. Yeah. But it's also in the sense that you realize what a long way something as simple as color correction goes.
That makes such a big difference.
So much of the footage that just looked sort of garish and ugly in Whedon's theatrical cut of it here has been color corrected to what Zack Snyder wants. And while you can complain that maybe it's a little too, the old dismal gray, it's much more striking and frankly, for lack of a better word, cinematic. It looks better.
Yes. Yeah. You and I have affection for some Joss Whedon projects, setting aside everything that's going on with him right now and the revelations about him. You and I have some affection for some of his projects. I would never describe him as an especially gifted visual storyteller.
Yeah.
At least particularly in a big screen medium. I don't think his films have been especially cinematic, and I think working in the Marvel universe, they've been allowed to be kind of televisual because a lot of Marvel's output is kind of televisual in a number of ways. That you can really tell the difference visually with this, and sometimes it is color correction, and sometimes it's whole scenes that Snyder either shot differently the first time or reshot. There's one scene where the very boring generic villain, his name's Steppenwolf, goes to Wonder Woman's Amazon homeland to retrieve one of the glowy MacGuffin boxes that drive the plot of this thing. And it is staged. I mean, in terms of what happens in the scene, the result is the same, but it's staged so much better in Snyder's version. Do you agree?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, you watch that scene now for the scene set in the Amazon homeland, and it. Now you sort of understand, that's what that's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
You realize just how disastrously action can be harmed by trying to chop it down from its original vision. Like the way that somebody stages and films an action sequence depends so much upon timing and shots and position and framing. Yeah. And so when somebody else goes in there and says, okay, this just needs to be shorter, I think it really speaks to how completely that can hamstring an effective action scene.
And it just looks less chintzy too. I mean, like part of it is that sometimes in their costumes, these characters look silly and chintzy. They look like actors in costumes, but they look less that way in Snyder's version, honestly. And I think it does have to do with texture and with how he films them. And so it is just on a whole, it's a much better looking movie.
It is. I mean, and that's not to say it's completely better looking. There's definitely, I think, a few, and I don't know if you agree with me on this, there's a few places where it seems like the fact that this is a sort of Snyder cut assembled from the ground up, the seams are still showing, I think, and especially some of the CGI and stuff with the characters where they'll look the people will look very CGI.
And I think that's always been a problem with his superhero movies, to be honest, with Snyder's. I mean, I think that his he kind of actually almost prefers this kind of rubbery, unreal aesthetic sometimes. And so, I think that the climax of this movie, by the way, we're gonna discuss a few spoilers over the course of this episode. If you are looking to know nothing about this version, which again does more or less unfold the same way in terms of plot, but we will be getting into specifics of how it's different. Yeah, you've been warned. I mean, turn it off if you don't want to hear anything about that. But the climax of this film is different in a lot of ways. I mean, it's at nighttime now. The whole aspect of them rescuing civilians is gone, of course, because it's a Zack Snyder movie again.
He's finally got his perfect environment. No civilians he has to worry about.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, well, they're not going to kill anybody. There's nobody around. And Superman wears a dark suit, but it's a more strikingly put together scene in a lot of ways, even as it uses some of the same footage. I mean, there is repeated footage. At the same time, though, we are watching CGI figures zip around the frame, and it doesn't necessarily look more real than. And maybe maybe that's not something you require out of a superhero movie, but I still think it looks. There is still some bad CGI in this version, even if it looks better than it did in the Whedon cut.
Yeah, very much so. I that being said, of course, again, maybe this is damning with faint praise, but I would so much rather watch, Zack Snyder's version of this final sequence than the one that we got in that original theatrical cut. Just because at least
100%.
I can tell what's going on. It looks like this is, it's got a sense of scope. It's got a sense of purpose. It's got a sense of driving momentum, going somewhere. I think in particular, and maybe this is one of those things, we were talking about spoilers, but in this one, as you said, Superman is now in a black suit. When Superman shows up in this one, in the theatrical version, it's sort of like, oh, here he comes. He's come to join the team, and now the fight continues. In this one, the second Superman shows up, Steppenwolf is fucking dust, buddy. Like, he's down for the count.
Yeah, that's totally true. Yep. So a lot of the additions in this, I mean, if you want to just talk about scene for scene, because again, this is a 4-hour movie. The theatrical cut of the film was 2 hours. It now takes the entire run of the theatrical cut to get the team together. All of that first 2 hours is the assembly stuff, is them getting together. So we are 2 hours into this film before they're a team and they're going about their business. So we have just a ton of stuff that, some of it essential and some of it playing like deleted scenes, if you ask me. I mean, I think that the most positive addition is that Cyborg is a character in this movie. Yeah. I mean, He's not like the most interesting character. He's probably still the dullest of this group in a way, the least developed, but he has an arc. And they give him an origin story. It doesn't seem like what the hell is this guy even doing here anymore? We get it. There's a whole, I mean, it actually reminded me a lot of there's a sequence that reminded me a bit anyway of Snyder's take on the Dr. Manhattan scene in Watchmen, where he's trying to sort of borrow some of the gravity of that and apply it to Cyborg's story. His stuff is much improved, and to the point where like you can see just how much of Cyborg's role in that movie was just ruthlessly like shaved off. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think troubling, all the sort of troubling allegations about Whedon's behavior aside, if I was Ray Fisher, I'd be pissed simply for the fact that my character was reduced to a nothing as opposed to an actual character.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the Adrian Brody and the Thin Red Line thing, where like I mean, at least he maybe that's not a perfect comparison because who the fuck knows what the final cut's going to look like in a Terrence Malick movie with how much he shoots. But like I could just imagine being Fisher and showing up to see that cut and being like, I'm barely in this movie and it like my presence in it actually doesn't even really make sense, whereas it does make sense in Snyder's cut,
Yeah, exactly. Like for all of the things that I think feel extraneous, and I think you and I probably agree that a lot of the material in this movie feels extraneous. Things like Kiersey Clemens' character, for example, a lot was made about how she was cut entirely from the film. She's in this for maybe 2 minutes tops. Yeah. I mean, it's a completely pointless aside. Whereas, all of the Fisher stuff actually makes his arc essential to telling the story of Justice League.
Very much so. I mean, I think what it comes down to is this did not need to be a 4-hour movie, like in any case. I mean, it like. No. The 2-hour cut is butchered. That much is very clear. But the 4-hour cut is amazingly bloated and full of super extraneous stuff. I mean, like there are 3 scenes of Steppenwolf.
Oh God, these scenes.
Like basically like calling in to his boss to tell him how it's going. There are 3 separate scenes of that. And I partially those exist, I think, to set up Darkseid a little bit more, who appears in the film a bit, you know? I mean, he doesn't do anything that cool. I guess he's in the flashbacks as well. But, like, we don't need 3 of those scenes. So to me, it often feels, watching the movie, it often feels like Snyder didn't just say, I want to make my own, like, I want to make the cut I was going to make back then. It sort of feels like he took literally everything he shot and threw it back into the movie.
Yeah, like you mentioned the article on Vanity Fair that people can read where it's sort of, a lot was made about how Whedon sort of seemed to take the things that he was still smarting about from the critical, disappointment of Age of Ultron and applied it to Justice League. This is very much Zack Snyder, sort of smarting from being kicked off this movie and saying, oh, like, I can have it back. Well, I'm going to give you everything.
Right. I mean, I tried to write this in the review, which is to say that there is no way, had circumstances been different and Snyder had been able to finish the film and there had been less interference from DC, there's still no way that the version that you will watch on HBO Max is the version of this that goes into official release. There's no way.
Oh God, no. This is, I always think of, this is the equivalent, I think of that famous line, I think it's from Wonder Boys, right? Where they say, like, being a storyteller is about making choices.
Right.
And Zack Snyder made all of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's an assembly cut, right? I mean, we can call it that, can't we? It really plays like an assembly cut. That he took everything, and here's the thing: he didn't just add everything back in that he shot. He shot more stuff.
Yeah,
yeah.
He took an already, like, that's part of what's frustrating, I think, about the sort of historical revisionism that's happening right now, right? I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation if the theatrical version of Justice League had been a success.
Right.
But B, that, somehow because that version was bad, that means this is the good one. This is the right one. And that's just not true. This is just as much, like, you can see why at that initial, when he screened this for, executives, they said, oh dear God, this can't be what we release.
Right. No, it's the Dominion prequel to The Exorcist problem, honestly, which is that the other cut is that both these cuts don't really work, and I think I might have a little bit more affection for this one than I have for the theatrical, simply because it is entirely Zack Snyder's movie. It doesn't have that frankly, like, useless mix of sensibilities that marks the theatrical cut,
Agreed.
Like, it is just uncut Snyder, and I kind of appreciate that on some abstract level, even though he's not a filmmaker I much respond to be honest. I still like that it's its own movie as opposed to nervously trying to be someone else's movie. I do think, though... Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I agree. I would much rather... to be honest, like, I mean, I'm not excited by the idea of rewatching 4 hours, but if I had to choose between which of these I'd rather rewatch, Snyder's version in a heartbeat.
So, like, kind of the same conclusion we came to when we were talking about the longer Batman v Superman, which, for me, it's like, it's a tough trade-off, because honestly, I don't necessarily want to spend that much time in this world again. But I would prefer a version that feels at least like at least like that it makes sense in terms of its creative vision. I would prefer that to such a grossly compromised version. Yeah. That being said, I do think there are things that Whedon added that do work and that I missed a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's an example of one?
Okay, so there is one that is 100% just a fix, where it's like they were losing footage, and they, like, a lot of the Lois Lane stuff in this movie, the stuff with Amy Adams as Lois Lane, was just like mercilessly like shaved off theatrical cut, and I get it, honestly, because not only is, like, you don't have the time for that for this in this version that's going to be like the length of something that will release in theaters. Beyond that, the Lois Lane stuff in the film is not compelling. It's compelling in theory, like following Lois Lane as she grieves is compelling. The actual scenes that Snyder wrote and shot for this are not compelling.
Yeah, poor Amy Adams is given nothing to work with.
Nothing to do. I mean, it's almost, it actually sort of feels almost like just insert grieving here, because I don't think that Snyder really cares that much about grief as a
her character could be a mop with a sad emoji taped on top of it.
Exactly. So there in the longer Snyder cut, there's this running thing about how Lois Lane visits the monument to Superman a lot. So she's just there, and so when again, spoilers, folks, if you haven't seen the new version or any version of it, I guess, but they bring Superman back, And when he comes back and goes to that monument, one of the better scenes in the theatrical cut, I'd say, to be honest, maybe just by comparison. But in the Snyder cut, in the original cut, you could say, she's just there, like, because she goes there a lot. Yeah. But because we have not established that in the shorter cut of the film, in the Whedon cut, there needs to be some explanation for why Lois Lane's there. She can't just show up. So Whedon comes up with this idea that I actually thought was halfway smart, which is that she becomes Bruce Wayne's contingency plan. He refers to her as the big gun, he keeps saying. And we are expecting Batman to bust out a literal weapon when Superman is about to kill him. And we realize that the big gun is Lois Lane. Frankly, that's a smart idea.
Yeah. Agreed.
Like, that is a genuinely smart idea.
I agree 100%. And that's the thing. And that you can see that time and again is so many times where that theatrical attempts to salvage things in this movie that are just a mess.
Yeah.
So many things happen here. For a movie that's 4 hours long, so much of it is just inexplicable. Halfway through, I think it's about roughly halfway through, there's this very sort of heartfelt scene between Lois Lane and Clark's mother, Martha, right? Where they sort of have this heart-to-heart and this whole thing, and she gives her a speech about how she needs to be a reporter again and all this. And then Martha leaves, and it transforms into the Martian Manhunter, who we have never seen before in this universe.
I know,
we have
so
no
confusing.
idea what he's doing there. It's so confusing.
Like, I know who that character is because I read comics. I cannot even imagine what anyone would be thinking when that moment happens. Because, furthermore, it's not like the movie clarifies at any point. Like, I think we are meant to think, watching it, that the Martian Manhunter is impersonating his mother in that moment. Yeah. But for all you might know, honestly, with the information we're given, it could just be that she was always the Martian Manhunter.
Right.
You know, I don't know. The movie doesn't say.
It doesn't say.
That to me feels like one of the many scenes in the film that might actually be a addition that he added. And we're gonna get to another one of those in a minute. But I think that another thing that I actually did really like in Whedon's cut is there is a conversation that Bruce Wayne has with Wonder Woman about him realizing, maybe it's with Alfred actually. Now I'm having trouble remembering. I think it might actually be
it's with Alfred.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he has a conversation with Alfred where he basically admits that because of his wealth and the way that he's lived his entire life, Superman is actually more human than he is. Like, Superman held a job and went around the world and lived his life. And that's a smart idea that Whedon brought to the project, you know? It's also a humanizing touch. You can tell that he was constantly, through his version, trying to humanize these characters a little bit more. And again, that's part of the schizophrenia of it, because Snyder does not see these characters as human, really. He sees them as gods among us. So the Whedon cut of it, there's a lot of really incongruous, like personality beats that don't fit with the conception of those characters.
Yeah, very much so.
I still miss some of them, though, to be honest. I still miss
them. Yeah. I think, and you can sort of see that. This has been sort of a Snyder thing from the start, right? Is that his characters are rarely characters so much as they're sort of archetypes, right? Or they're these sort of larger than life mythological figures. He's in some ways he's still sort of making 300, right? His big breakthrough. Where you see that time again in this film where, you have all these things that happen to these people, and even, Cyborg or whoever, these things happen, these terrible, dramatic human moments of human drama happen to them, but that's all that it is. They just happen. There's no sort of real human relating to them or attempt to sort of empathize or convey that in some way that audiences can identify.
They're tortured. They're all tortured. He gets that. Being tortured is something that Zack Snyder gets.
Oh, yeah. He loves torture.
Yeah. But they're never tortured in a way that's relatable, necessarily. Yeah. And again, maybe that's his vision of this world. They shouldn't be relatable. They're gods among us, that sort of thing. But I did find myself missing at least a few of Whedon's beats in terms of, like, maybe trying to understand these characters as people. Like, genuinely being like, they should have... they're basically every one of his characters in Snyder's conception of them basically just has parental issues. That's like their one thing, is that they all have mommy or daddy issues. That's what unites them all, right?
Yeah, very much so. And even when he tries to do something different, I think for example, the character of the Flash in this film, right? Who, has a very different sort of personality, a very different persona. He's not this sort of tortured, sullen, withdrawn guy that so many of the other characters are, or this sort of like larger than life noble like Wonder Woman. He's this sort of like bad with human connection, but his response is sort of logorrhea, and he can't stop talking, and he can't stop just sort of like, being awkward at every given moment. But he does it in such a way, like you see in the theatrical cut, like that actually comes across as sort of dorky and relatable. Whereas here, it's genuinely off-putting at times.
Yeah. Well, one of the things is that Whedon added a vulnerability in the. Again, I'm almost hesitating to even to give Whedon too much credit, because so much of that theatrical cut is just such a. Such a garish clash of sensibilities.
Yeah, let's be clear. We're trying to find nice things to say about it here.
But there's a little beat between him and Batman during that interminable fight in the tunnels, where he basically says, "I've never been in a fight before. I just push someone and run away," and that's a real vulnerability that he's giving that character. He's like, the Flash is somebody who he's not necessarily really a fighter. He's never done this before. He is a character who he has stopped some criminals before, but he has never fought anyone before. And that's an idea about this character. Snyder isn't interested in that. I mean, the Flash he never has any moment of self-doubt about fighting anyone, about being a hero, because his characters don't have those moments of self-doubt, really.
Yeah, they go from zero to being superpowered gods among men.
Right.
And again, like you said, that that being said, like these are the few and far between moments that we're talking about. By and large, the way that we cut down and edited it was a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really like either version, to be honest with you, but I think that the longer one is more itself, so I appreciate that on some level. I do want to talk though about the ending of this film,
oh boy,
or the endings, plural. Because, so Snyder cuts the film. I mean, there was talk for a little bit of the film being a miniseries, and when you watch it, you understand why. That actually might make a little bit more sense, honestly, than this 4-hour block of plot and incident, where there really is no rhythm to how he cut a lot of it together, in my opinion. Like, you could rearrange a lot of the first half, and it would basically still be the same movie. There's, we're like going to these different fantasy worlds, going to these different characters. There's no momentum to it in the first half. But there is an addition to, so he cuts it into 6 chapters, and then there's an epilogue. And I don't know this for sure. I feel like I sort of got hints of this in some of what I've read about the film. I think that epilogue is a new invention of Snyder's. I don't think that was originally intended to be in the film, because it certainly does not play like something that anybody ever would have said, yes, this can be the end of your movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's nobody would take a look at it and say, yes, this is a movie ending.
So for those who don't want to know what happens at the end of it, you can click off now. For those who don't care, I just want to know. The movie more or less, there's a long epilogue which includes footage that was used in the theatrical cut as well, where they're sort of building it's like a meeting between Lex Luthor and Deathstroke. The two of them meet. So that's in the theatrical cut. Afterwards, though, we get this long dream sequence, basically sort of set in the hypothetical possible future established in Batman v Superman, actually, during one of the dream sequences in that. And it's this world where Batman and a sort of a motley crew of heroes have to fight Superman. It's unclear. There seems to have been some sort of doomsday scenario. The world is covered in ash now. And the whole sequence plays blatantly the whole sequence is entirely superfluous. It exists possibly to set up a movie that is never going to be made, that we will never see. There might be some future version of this that's where there's it's never going to be made. Let's be clear.
Yeah.
Whatever this is setting up is not a movie that will be made. But I think that it thinks it's setting up some ultimate dystopian sequel to Justice League or something. And Jared Leto is there. He reprises his role as the Joker, although he plays the role completely differently than he did in Suicide Squad. And it honestly, more than anything else in this film, feels completely like Zack Snyder said, this will look cool and I want to add it.
And what makes it so ridiculous of all is that at the end of it, right, at the end of this, it's at least 10 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, that scene, it ends and Bruce Wayne wakes up and it was a dream of his that then he wakes up and comes to, and the Martian Manhunter comes to visit him and tell him all about how he wants to help humanity, which is also completely extraneous. And as far as I can tell, also an addition that's just done because I think, as you said, they added that scene in the middle where he appears out of nowhere.
Right. I think that was a reshoot too. I have a feeling, for one thing, because Affleck's performance, he does not look like he could give less of a shit. His response to meeting the Martian Manhunter, a shape-shifting alien from space, is, well, I'm paraphrasing here, but this is pretty close to it. Well, we could use all the help we can get. That's like all he says. He like comes out like looking hungover, says that, and then goes back inside, and it's just like, this is the conclusion to your film. This is how you wanted to end your magisterial, much fabled Snyder Cut. I don't know.
Yeah, it's genuinely baffling. Like my jaw was on the floor during the last 20 minutes of this film, because I was like, not only is this not an ending, this is just the first 20, this is something else entirely. Like it has no place being here.
Okay, so I feel like you already answered this, but which version do you prefer?
Yeah, I say all else aside, I still prefer this version of Justice League to the theatrical version. This plays like a movie. This plays like something that was meant to be assembled in this way. It doesn't feel like this awful, sort of badly, hackily put together rush job.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way.
All right. Thanks so much for listening. Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League is now available to stream on HBO Max. Please rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get podcasts.
This special bonus episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by special guest Alex McLevy. It was produced and edited by Carl Blomberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Zach Goldsboro, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. If you'd like to hear more about the DCEU and our separate thoughts on that, there's a full episode of Film Club where we get into the various films, talk about Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, the whole franchise. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts as well. Thanks a lot, folks.